El mundo nunca se detiene. Surgen nuevos delitos y aparecen mercados ilícitos. Si queremos combatir el delito, entender las causas de la violencia, reducir la corrupción, mejorar la gobernanza, fortalecer nuestros sistemas de justicia penal y promover el Estado de Derecho, debemos contestar preguntas que no han sido respondidas. Y no podemos medir nuestro progreso sin datos. ¿Pero cómo lo hacemos? Teniendo datos confiables y exhaustivos, aprovechando los registros administrativos, realizando encuestas a la población y a las empresas. Nuestra meta es proteger al mundo y construir sociedades libres de miedo, libres de violencia, para fomentar el desarrollo sostenible.
Bienvenidos. Tercera Conferencia Internacional sobre Estadísticas de Gobernanza, Seguridad y Justicia.
Welcome to the third International Conference on Governance, Crime and Justice Statistics.
Muchas gracias por estar en esta sesión paralela donde vamos a tratar un tema muy importante, también muy escabroso, porque estamos hablando de la necesidad de medir el desempeño gubernamental y es una de estas cuestiones no solamente de moda, sino además muy necesaria, porque implica un proceso de rendición de cuentas único probablemente en las últimas décadas en el mundo, donde los ciudadanos estamos solicitando y exigiendo cada vez más conocer exactamente qué es lo que el gobierno hace, pero en realidad lo que nos interesa es qué es lo que el gobierno logra. Y medir lo que hace puede ser complicado, pero es posible. Medir lo que logra es mucho más difícil todavía. Tenemos entonces un excelente grupo con 4 panelistas. Nuestra panelista quinta desafortunadamente no pudo asistir, entonces bueno, pues tendremos en todo caso un poco más de espacio para la discusión. La dinámica entonces será que otorgaremos 15 minutos a cada uno de nuestros panelistas y a partir de ello generaremos una primera sesión de discusión entre los propios panelistas con los puntos que hayan tratado en sus presentaciones y luego una sesión de preguntas y respuestas con ustedes, nuestro público, en este espacio. Bueno, pues comenzamos entonces con la primera presentación, que es de mi amiga, mi compañera Patria de Lancer Jones. Voy a leer muy rápidamente algunos pequeños datos, ustedes tienen más en el brochure que tienen que les entregaron. Patria es directora de la Escuela de Public Affairs en Penn State, Harrisburg. Ella obtuvo el doctorado en Public Administration en la Universidad de Rutgers. Perdón por mi Spanglish, que ya lo estoy combinando aquí porque estoy leyendo. Su investigación está dirigida justamente al tema de performance measurement y rendición de cuentas, innovación, corrupción en gobiernos y gobernanza dirigida por ciudadanos. Tiene varias publicaciones sobre este tema. Ella realmente es una persona muy reconocida en Estados Unidos y también en América Latina en el tema, y sin más le doy la palabra. Su presentación es Developing and Implementing Sustainable Performance Indicators in the Public Sector. Patria, muchas gracias, bienvenida.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I am very honored to be to having invited to come and speak with you about a very important topic that has been dear to my life, my professional life. See, I get used to this. So here, basically, we're going to be talking about this sustainable development, and what I find very interesting, which is a very welcome development in sustainable development, is that the idea of sustainable development has evolved from a focus on environment to a focus on what we call now the three-legged stool, which basically is a balanced approach that consists of environmental, economic, and societal elements. With that in mind, then, I feel that the agenda for sustainable development is really a great example now of this new framework, of this new discourse in what sustainable development is about. So my presentation, I'm going to reflect a little bit on performance measurement in general, but the question that guides my research and my presentation today is really how can performance management systems support the implementation of sustainable development goals. That's really my goal here, is to talk very generally in terms of that. So it turns out that I changed. So these are the 2030 Agenda for a Sustainable Development. And the reason what I put here is just to make sure that we keep in the back of our mind that all of these goals, there are 17 of these goals, are interconnected. And that as we are addressing one, we really cannot forget about the other goals, because the effects, while we may not be able to measure the combined effect, at least we need to be able to understand that each one of these goals and policies are going to have an impact on the other. So the goal that I focus on to prepare this presentation today is Goal 16, which has 10 objectives and 2 sub-objectives. I think that this is a very interesting conference, because what the UN is looking to do is to complete or to achieve the millennial goals that are goals that were not achieved. So of course that begs the question of why were they not achieved? So, but be that as it may, at least here we are. This represents a great opportunity, but also represents a challenge. And the opportunity that I see is that now we are really, at least from what I could read in terms of how they develop this framework, is that we are developing a consensus. We are having a global dialogue that is telling us what are the priorities that we want for our global community. So I see that as a great opportunity in terms of these 17 goals and 169 targets. The other thing that I find very interesting, and I think that we need to keep in mind, and is that the UN has also recognized that we need to pay attention to the political process, because politics matters. And it's not, without an understanding of this, we are going to be doomed to fail once again. So what is the context of this agenda for sustainable development? Here, I'm just going to, and I think that's really what how this framework was developed represents the context in which we are operating right now. The context is what Donald Kettle has called the transformation of governance. Basically, what it means is that the problems, the definition of the problems and the solutions are no longer within the domain of government, but rather that these solutions, the coming up with the solutions and the implementation of these solutions have to engage stakeholders. These include government, private companies, the private sector, citizens, you name it. So now, no longer this is actually a responsibility of all. So that's the context that I see. Another context, and that has been discussed a little bit since yesterday and today, is this idea that we need evidence-based in support of good governance. And this without this kind of, without the use of evidence, then the question, how are we going to know that we are achieving the goals, and if we are not achieving the goals, then how are we going to know what we are supposed to be doing? So I believe that this is a very important context for the implementation of this Sustainable Development framework. Since I have 15 minutes, I'm trying to go, but I think I'm doing well. Now, good. Now, one thing that I will argue here is that in order for us to be successful at really implementing and obtaining these goals, we are going to have to integrate these sustainable development goals with performance measurement, with program level performance measurement. The way that I see it, these sustainable development goals are very similar to the movement on community indicators, which are developed in collaboration with citizens and nonprofit organizations, where a decision is made as to what are the outcomes that are important to citizens. And I think that's exactly what the UN now is trying to do with these global indicators. Now, these sustainability goals, if you see, are high level. They are aspirational goals of what we see that represent the global community's desire for community outcomes. Performance measurement now, so you have these goals over here, these high-level goals. Then performance measurement is really dealing with a low-level, meaning they are lower, but they are no low level. There are still important levels of program level indicators. And they are basically your quantifiable measures about the performance of a program in terms, and this includes inputs, outputs, outcomes, efficiency, and cost effectiveness. So also the way that I see this, both your sustainable goals and performance measurement both produce knowledge that can be used for decision making, right? Because the question that I always ask, so what? So what if your indicators are showing you that you are achieving something or you're not achieving? So what? What are you going to do about it? And that's the opportunity that focusing on performance measurement is going to give us. So here, I just wanted to show you a somewhat perhaps daunting, like it's a little bit scary, because from a methodological perspective. I just wanted to show how if we want to integrate the global development goals with country-level goals, what do we need to keep in mind? First of all, of course, these sustainable development goals, as I said, there are 17 of them. Now, the UN also recognizes that there are different government priorities. So what I recognize is that each country's goals must be informed by the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and that the UN Sustainable Development Goals then definitely should be informed by the priorities of these different countries. Now, in order for us to be able to actually get some, to implement these goals, we are going to have to develop policies, right? Because the policies is basically how we are going to execute, how we are going to implement these very laudable goals, which also call for disaggregated data. So not just at a very high level data, but also calls for disaggregated data. Now, what do you need to do then with the policies? Well, then you need to develop programs. So if you have goals without policies and programs, well, I have bad news. You are not going to achieve your goals. So I was trying to find out from our friends whether or not there are certain policies that are actually associated with these goals, and I really haven't seen it, but I do hope so, because without these policies and programs, then we're going to have a hard time achieving these goals. And then, of course, the argument that I make here about this integration is that then you're going to have to develop performance measures to look at how these programs are doing. These performance measures is supposed to form this feedback loop that allows you to improve, change, or do whatever you need to do with the programs if the programs are not achieving the goals or the outcomes that you're trying to achieve. And this then is supposed to inform policies, and then again we go back to the goals. So it is a very, double loop learning, I suppose we call it. Now, there is something a little bit difficult here that we're going to have to confront, and is part of a challenge. So if you notice, let me see if I figure this one out. No, I was trying to point at, doesn't work. So if you see, I have something called proximal outcomes. Basically, what these proximal outcomes are, those kind of outcomes or results that can be seen in a short-term period. And then on the right-hand side, you see that I'm basically recognizing that the policies, the outcomes of these goals that the UN has are going to take time. Now just think about that. They are going to take time. That's going to represent a challenge, and I have 5 minutes, but I can do this. So what are some of the challenges that we're going to find? First, there was a good question, very good question this morning, in terms of do we have knowledge about whether or not information is being used? And yes, there is research, and unfortunately, there are many challenges to this knowledge being used. And so one of the challenges that you're going to have, because a lot of these countries and a lot of organizations say, oh, sure, we have adopted the goals and objectives. And then when they get the indicators, they just put them like right under in the drawer or something, so they don't really use. So we're going to have a challenge there to say, how can we make sure that the information that's being produced by these indicators, right, and by these performance measures are used. The second thing that you're going to have a challenge with is sustaining the participation. It is my understanding that there are some member countries, and I think that part of their participation requires them to pay for some of their participation, like sending people to these expert groups and things like that. So that's going to be a challenge, making sure that they continue to participate, as well as how do you ensure that there is an effective representation of the complexity of complex values that each one of these countries has, because inevitably their values are going to be different if you go across countries. Again, also maintaining the financial viability, and part of that is going to require that they have appropriate capacity to collect and to implement data. Also, how do you get buy-in? And that's the problem. Again, they will say, sure, we're going to do this. But really, are they really going to implement that? Especially when you know that for political figures, they have a very short time horizon, right? Like 4 years. I think here in Mexico is 5 years. And most of these things are long-term. So how are you going to convince them to say, sure, we're going to stick with this because this is important? Well, one possibility is that you focus on process measures and short-term outcomes so that they can see some gains, so that they can see some success. You see like baby steps, and that then may encourage them to stay in the game, and you may get the buy-in. There are also some methodological problems. Of course, part of that requires the collection of valid data, and at a meeting yesterday, we found out, for example, that even though there are some instruments that have been developed, I believe it's for the survey on victimization, some countries decide that they are going to ask different questions. So if you have that kind of, so the data, once you start asking, changing things, that may not be valid anymore. So you're going to have to solve those kind of problems. Let me move on. This is just a model that I developed in terms of, this is really, what are the factors that influence the use of performance measurement? This model is really at the organizational level, but I believe that the factors that we identify here can also be applied at a larger scale. For example, do they have a capacity for action? Do they have the capacity to collect, analyze, and report data? I think that's something, if you don't have that capacity, you're not going to be able to have proper implementation of these goals. Now, having a capacity to do this doesn't mean that they're actually going to do it. Then you're going to have to also deal with the culture of the organization. You're also going to have to deal with the political processes. So just a quick thing. Now, what are some conditions necessary for integration? First, you're going to have to make sure that the programs and these policies affect a sufficient proportion of the population to be of interest to the community. If they don't, then there's not going to be a lot of interest, or they're going to say, sure, we're interested in these indicators, but there's, oh my goodness gracious, there's not going to be enough. Hey, there's one missing, so one speaker missing, I got 2 minutes. Well, let me just tell you, perhaps leave on an account. I had something on the accountable. I have some issues with this goal 16, particularly in how do we measure accountable and transparent institution, because I do not believe that these indicators actually get to this particular objective. I forget about that. Let me just give you then what you can do also to some considerations, and I know that there are some program evaluators in this conference. And I think that, I know there are a lot of statisticians here, but guess what? You can't do this alone. You're going to have to engage the performance measurement and program evaluation community. In particular, I wanted to mention a little bit, for example, the issue of program theory. With a program, first of all, since we can't do everything that might help, which services are more important? Which one needs to be combined with other services in order to be most effective? These are questions that can be answered with appropriate program theory. Now, also, there's another tool, what we call a logic model, that can help you to see how programs are supposed to work, so they provide you a picture of what your program theory is. I also want to leave you with the idea that we need to think about systems. The system theory, one of the criticism of the performance measurement paradigm is that it thinks of or presumes simplistic models of causality. The questions, the issues that we are discussing here, crime, victimization, all that kind of stuff, those are what Patton has called complex problems. And complex problems then are going to require complex solution. Especially, they are going to require what he calls a system solution. And he said that the question of whether something works can be answered as whether the effect the program has on the outcome is attributed to the implementation of intervention alone or to a joint effect of the implementation of intervention and of other factors in action model. Bottom line, there are a lot of smart people. We cannot work in silos. We have to collaborate, and if the UN really, if we want to really be able to obtain these goals that were not obtained before, these millennial goals, and we want to make sure this gets implemented, we got to go beyond simply collecting data to show indicators and try to promote the use, the development of policies that actually support these goals, and then we also need to promote the measurement so that we know, are we getting to where we want to get? And that's the end of it. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Patria. En efecto, este es uno de los más importantes dilemas, medir. Cuando hablamos de comportamientos de personas que logran cosas, implica involucrar, curiosamente, a las personas. Bueno, es un importante punto. Bueno, me gustaría presentarles ahora a Benedict Godrich. Él es un investigador en el Instituto de Investigación Social en Holanda. Ha tenido varias posiciones de profesor en diversas universidades, incluidas Cambridge y Oxford. Tiene un doctorado en economía por la Universidad de Tilburg. Actualmente trabaja en términos de estudios comparativos del sector público, y justamente lo que nos va a hablar hoy es uno muy interesante de análisis comparativos de 36 países en términos de medición de logros y de desempeño en estos mismos países en un contexto de pobreza. Bueno, pues bienvenido, muchísimas gracias. Benedict, tienes la palabra.
Buenos dias, good morning. My name is Benedict Godrich. I'm with the Netherlands Institute for Social Research. Let me start also by thanking the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present some of the recent work we've been doing at our institute. This is a joint effort of a group of colleagues at our institute. We are one of the 3 government research institutes in the Netherlands, and our institute looks mainly at social and cultural themes. So we look at, for example, education, we look at poverty, we look at social security, all kinds of social and also cultural themes within the Netherlands, and we report to government and to other stakeholders. This is a report that was written for the 3rd time, the 3rd edition of this report. The research was partly financed by one of our ministries, the Ministry of the Interior in the Netherlands. And the findings in this report were intended to serve as input for the Dutch presidency of the European Union, the first half of 2016. I'm very honored to be able to present it here. We also presented it in Brussels at several meetings of the European Commission, and as well as in the Netherlands. The motivation of the study, the reason that the ministry has been interested in this for quite some time, and the reason that we are also working on this since 2004, and particularly this time, has to do with the vast differences we observe across welfare states in the developed world. So if you look at Western welfare states, then it's quite surprising if you look at the history of the development of welfare states across Europe, for example, then a lot of that history is quite similar across countries. So it all started in the second half of the 19th century as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and it really got going after the Second World War, when there was a political desire for peace and security, which led all these countries to develop more and more welfare state provisions. And even though all these countries have quite similar histories in terms of the development of their welfare states, the actual provisions that they have implemented are quite different across countries. So I think that makes it interesting to compare the performance of these countries in terms of these welfare state provisions and in terms of the outcomes that welfare state policies are trying to achieve. There's a more recent question that has really become quite important, and it's also one that has been discussed a lot in Europe, which is the sustainability, the fiscal sustainability of welfare states. We see a lot of population aging in many of these countries. We see huge increases in the use of very expensive welfare state provisions, such as healthcare, such as long-term care, such as pensions. And this really raises the question, can we sustain this level of welfare state, these levels of the welfare state in the future? And that also makes it interesting to compare countries in terms of how well they have been doing and what these policies have actually achieved. The framework of the study uses the concepts of inputs, outputs, and outcomes of the public sector. So, for example, an input could be a government that finances the building of schools or the payment of teachers. Outputs could be, for example, the number of students that are enrolled in school. You can think of that as an output of the education sector. And then the ultimate outcomes are, for example, the cognitive skills of children. That could be an ultimate outcome of public sector policy. So it's across all the sectors that we look at, we use that distinction between inputs, outputs, and outcomes. We look at 36 countries, all current 28 European Union member states, and we look at 8 other countries for comparison: Australia, Canada, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Norway, Switzerland, and the US. These 36 countries can be divided in 7 geographical regions. And we look at the period 1995 to 2012. This report was published end of last year. In some cases, we had data for 2013 as well. We look at 9 sectors within the public sector. Education and health we look at in most detail. Social safety, housing, social security, and public administration we analyze from a little bit more basic level, and then we have a very brief discussion of 3 other sectors. So what are the central research questions? First, we try to address the question of how countries perform in terms of the outcome indicators. How well are countries doing across these outcomes in the various parts of the public sector? How much do countries invest in terms of inputs? How much money do they spend on schools? How much money do they spend on hospitals, for example? And how much do they produce in terms of outputs? How do differences in outcomes between countries and over time relate to differences in inputs and outputs? Can we say something about whether spending money has been effective in terms of achieving the goals that you're trying to achieve? We also ask whether citizens of these countries actually perceive the quality of the corresponding sector as better if the actual performance is better. So if you're achieving your goals in education, do your citizens actually perceive you to be successful? Is there a link between those two concepts? And then the last question, we only address that question in the chapters on education and health. Which factors explain differences in these outcome indicators between countries and over time? So that's really a causal question. So a lot of the research in this report, I would not like to give a causal interpretation to these results because causality is very difficult concept. In some cases, in particular in education and health, and it's all in the report, it's all online available at our website. In these two chapters, we really try to make a serious attempt at getting to the causal question of what is really ultimately driving these outcomes. What are the factors that make 15-year-old children perform very well in mathematics or reading, for example? That could be one, and that's one of the questions we try to look at. So what are these outcome indicators? In my presentation, I will confine myself to the outcomes that we use. Well, in education, we look at the OECD's PISA maths and reading scores. These are the scores in internationally standardized tests that PISA has been conducting since 2000 on maths, reading, and science. So we simply look at how well the 15-year-old children in the various countries are doing in terms of mathematics and reading. And this should reflect a country's cognitive skills, the cognitive skills of children. We also look at the variation in these scores that is explained by socioeconomic status. That's an indicator that the OECD has developed to measure equal access in education. The idea is if you have equal opportunity in education for every child, then that should mean that the socioeconomic status of his or her parents should not matter for his or her performance. So the more we can explain these scores by socioeconomic status of parents, the lower actually the equal access of the equal opportunity in education. For health, we look at life expectancy and infant mortality. For social safety, and I'll be briefly saying something about that at the end of the presentation, we look at recorded crime rates. For housing, we look at whether households experience problems in terms of the quality of the dwellings, the space, and the affordability. Social security, we look at poverty, we look at unemployment and non-employment in youth, and we look at the pension replacement rate. This is basically how much of your income you retain after retirement. And in terms of public administration, we use as a main indicator, the World Bank Good Governance Indicators. I won't be able to give you all the results. The report is more than 300 pages, but there is actually an online, very brief, concise summary with some interactive graphs as well. But I can give you some of the main results. So here you see actually 5 of these sectors I mentioned: education, health, housing, social security, and public administration. And you have to look at this figure in the following way. There are the 5 axes, and the further out you are from the origin, the better you are performing on average. So if you, for example, look at the vertical axis for education, the one on top, you can see that Northern Europe, the countries in Northern Europe, that's Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, countries in Northern Europe on average perform best in 2012 when it comes to the cognitive skills of children and offering equal opportunity in education. Western Europe lags just behind Northern Europe, and then you have Southern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe a little bit lower. These scores are actually normalized. So what that means is we looked at an average across the European Union, and we normalize the scores vis-à-vis the average European Union country. So in this case, for example, Northern Europe is around 0.5 for education. That means it's half a standard deviation it's performing half a standard deviation above the European Union average. Same goes approximately for Western Europe. And you can see that Southern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe are lagging behind. This pattern is pretty much the same for all other sectors, as you can see, with one exception, which is health in Southern Europe. So in terms of child mortality and life expectancy, Southern Europe is doing as well as Western Europe and almost as well as Northern Europe, so it's performing exceptionally well there. Central and Eastern Europe is still lagging behind, although it does better in social security than Southern Europe. I should say these are all snapshots in 2012. We've also looked, in particular for education and health, we've looked at what the trends are, and what we really see is that countries in Southern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe on average are converging towards the European average. So this is not it's a static picture, but there's a dynamic process of catching up and convergence behind it. I think that's important to mention. And if this process continues, then at some point we will have similar performance across these 4 European sectors. The other thing I wanted to say is that the countries that are not in here, because we did not have data for all 5 sectors, are these comparison countries outside Europe. And I want to mention a few of them. If you look at Korea, South Korea and Japan, and you would put it, because we have data for education, you would put it on the vertical axis for education in this graph, it would not even fit on the graph. So Korea and Japan on average are performing 2 standard deviations above the European Union average. So it would be outside the graph. And that's something that is perhaps to some of you well known, but still the differences in education is particularly pronounced. That also means that Europe has to sort of also learn from that. There are things that we can learn from the Eastern Asian countries in that respect. In terms of health, they also outperform the European regions. In terms of public administration, they lag behind a little bit. They're just below the European Union average. What about Northern America? On average, the United States and Canada, that's the 2 countries we have data for here. On average, they perform comparable to Western Europe, so comparable to the blue lines. They're somewhere in. There's one exception, which is health. There they actually perform quite a bit worse than Western Europe. So they are around the European Union average when it comes to child mortality and life expectancy. And this is particularly due to the quite weak performance of the United States. Australia and New Zealand, that's the final 7th region we looked at. Oceania is also performing comparable to Western Europe. Now, I have 5 minutes left. Good. Now I told you we have this digital electronic report. It's a new publication device that we're using because, and I think this is understandable, people don't really like to read reports of 300 pages or more. So we actually made a short interactive digital summary, which is now being opened. And I want to show you just a few numbers. Great. If you could just mouse over the Western Europe, the orange dot on the bottom right, not in the graph, but on the bottom right. To the right, and then, no, okay. There's these four dots. There's an orange one, a blue one, a green one. And a brown one, outside the map. Bottom right. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, great. That's what I wanted to show you. So there's always all kinds of things you can do with this. I'll show you the URL in a moment. If you're interested, maybe you want to have a look at some of these countries. Of course, the averages that I just reported, there's of course a lot of cross-country variation within the regions. For example, Western Europe, if you look at Western Europe, which we can see here, and you can also see it in the chart, you see that the Netherlands, for example, my own country, and Switzerland are doing quite well. So is Ireland. But there are also countries like France where things are a little bit less going less well. So there's quite a lot of variation still in terms of the intra-regional numbers. If you can just go below a little bit to the next region. Yes, great. Yeah, great. Here you see Finland is doing particularly well, and Sweden is doing a little bit less well. Yes, next one, Southern Europe. Here you can see that Greece is really not performing very well in 2012, perhaps somewhat unsurprisingly, given the recent experiences. Italy is doing okay. Portugal and Spain a little bit less well. Yes, and the last one, Central and Eastern Europe. This is really a region where, to be honest, we have put together countries that maybe you should not put together. There's really a lot of intra-regional variation here. And so even though I reported the average numbers to still be quite low, I said in almost all regions they still lag behind quite a little bit from the rest of Europe. Although they are converging quite fast, you also see that actually there's a lot of variation behind those averages. If you look at, for example, or in particular, you look at Estonia and you look at Poland, then they are doing extremely well in terms of education. The scores of Estonia, 1.35 standard deviations above the EU average is very remarkable performance. Bulgaria and Romania are still lagging behind more than 2 standard deviations. Well, Bulgaria more than 2 standard deviations, Romania a little bit less. So there's still some room to catch up there. Okay, move to the next slide. If I can, I first have to, I guess, get back to the, yeah, great, thank you. So I just have 2 more slides. I want to say a few things about social safety and crime, because it's also one of the sectors we look at. There's a reason it was not reported so far. We ran into a few data issues there. Unsurprisingly, given what we've heard this morning in the keynote speech. And the main reason is that we look at 36 countries, and it's quite a lot. And there's also quite a lot of years that we look at. So we really depend on indicators that have quite a wide coverage across countries and across time. What did we do in terms of social safety? We looked at police registrations, recorded crime. There are some issues with that, referring to the safety paradox. So this observation that there are quite wide differences across countries in terms of how much crime is actually reported. So in other words, if you have a very high level of crime, we cannot really be sure if that's because your crime level is high, your actual crime level is high, or because you just have high reporting shares. So you have high percentages of reporting. And that's a challenge. That's what researchers often call the safety paradox. So that means we have to be very careful with the interpretation of these results. But having said that, in Europe, Central and Eastern Europe showed by far the fewest recorded serious crimes in 2012. So that's either violence, robbery, burglary, motor vehicle theft, and drugs offenses, and these are weighted numbers. Northern Europe and Western European countries had the most recorded crimes, with the countries in Southern Europe scoring in the middle. And the weighted level of total recorded crime remained fairly constant in most countries over the period 1995 to 2012. There are a few exceptions. Bulgaria, Estonia, and the United Kingdom experienced a sharp reduction in crime, and Slovenia, Portugal, and Sweden experienced a substantial increase in crime. let me move to the last bullet for the sake of time. Citizens of countries with higher levels of recorded serious crime are more likely to trust their police and their legal system. So what does this mean? We also looked at, if you look at these recorded crime rates across countries, and you then ask, suppose a country is doing quite bad, it has very high recorded crime rates, how much do citizens of that country trust their police and their legal system? And what we actually find is that the higher your recorded crime rate, the higher the level of trust of citizens in the police and in the legal system. This is, at first sight, a little bit counterintuitive, but we think, but this is, we have to be careful here, but we think this might actually support the argument that high levels of recorded crime indicate a high tendency to report and to register. If you have high trust countries, then those are maybe also the countries where registration and recording of crime is managed best. But this is speculation. But it does mean that there are some issues that we have to address in terms of these data. And also it means that the victimization surveys, which we would have liked to use, but which are, even though they're available for some countries, not available for all 36 countries, at least not yet. So that's I think, something for future research. Thank you for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Benedict. Me gustaría presentarles ahora al profesor Raymond Cox III. Él es profesor en el Departamento de Administración Pública y Estudios Urbanos de la Universidad de Akron, doctor en Administración Pública y en Política Pública, tiene muy amplia producción académica, más de 5 libros y muchos artículos, ha desarrollado diferentes conferencias en Canadá, en México, en Sudáfrica y en Europa. En 2006 cabe destacar que fue reconocido por con el prestigioso premio Donald Stone de la American Society for Public Administration, ASPA, y creo yo que trae un tema sumamente interesante porque su ponencia nos habla de medir la integridad, que es algo diferente que solamente plantearse hablar de corrupción. Muchas gracias. Adelante.
Thank you, David. And again, thank you to the organizer of this conference to give me an opportunity to be here. And maybe you'll get a flavor for what I'm going to speak about by the fact that there are bubbles on my PowerPoint slides, because this is the soft discussion. Or we can just leave the bubbles up for the whole time. Let's see if I can do this. The topic is measuring integrity, and Benedict, I hope I can actually parallel some of the things you were talking about, because I'm going to talk about trustworthiness as opposed to specifically trust, but some of the same topics that you have begun to address. The first is I will take a stance by suggesting that the first thing to understand is that integrity is not merely the opposite of corruption. That we must, rather than look at corruption and say it's organizations that lack corruption, therefore have integrity, I want to expand and go deeper into the topic of integrity itself to see the variations there. In particular, I want to look at at least 2 different aspects, behavioral aspects of integrity, because integrity itself is best understood as behaviors rather than a thought process or theory. It is behaviors. What is important is to understand how people act in this context. The second aspect of this is that integrity, as understood as trustworthiness, is a notion that implies a voluntary relationship. Integrity as a relationship between the public and the government is, oddly enough, a relationship between strangers. I think one of the differences between the notion of trustworthiness and trust is, as we understand from the management literature on trust, it is an interaction between people within an organization. It's people that know each other. They develop a trust relationship. The reality of people's experience with governments is that you encounter strangers. You will go to an office to talk to somebody who you'll not have met. You might go back a few months later. You will meet someone else. And so trustworthiness is an experience and a judgment that you make before each encounter. And you must make it on the basis of a relationship with a stranger. You're judging them, in a sense, in the abstract, rather than on the basis of experiences. Okay. Pretend I didn't say that. Okay. One other thing that I want to make note here is that partly because trustworthiness is on the basis of voluntary relationship, it really doesn't have a lot to do with the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of law enforcement. For example, because it may not be that normally we look at things like integrity and corruption, we look at law. Do you have a law on X? Or do you have a law on Y topic? A classic would be the absence or presence of laws on whistleblower protections. And we use that as an indicator of a regime that's opposed to corruption. Well, the reality is that has nothing to do with it. That the corruption may or may not be present. And I have colleagues in Canada who for years actively resisted the introduction of a Whistleblower Protection Act in Canada because they said to themselves, we're Canadians. We don't do things like that. We would never attack a whistleblower until it became a major public scandal, quite literally in the late 1990s. Then they enacted the law. Before then, they insisted it was unnecessary. Well, so you would count Canada down. The U.S. had had a Whistleblower Protection Act since the 70s. We looked better on those anti-corruption or corruption scales, depending on how you want to define it, than Canada did. Well, maybe Canada was simply naive, but the law really had very little to do with anything we're talking about. Let's see, where am I? Okay. If we're going to then look at the question of integrity, and I'm stealing this and in part because Benedict is here, it is two fellow Dutchmen, or a Dutchman and Dutchwoman, Frederik Six and Leo Ubers, wrote a paper dealing with the issue of integrity a number of years ago, in which they emphasized this issue of trustworthiness as central to understanding trust, and they then relate it to public performance and the attitude of individual public employees or public servants. And therefore, I will just quickly make note of their comment here that integrity is based on relevant set of moral values, norms, and rules, not what I personally may hold as values and norms. In other words, integrity is the abstract notion of what is right for the public rather than what's right for me. That will be central to understanding the notion of integrity. It is based on public valuations and a public relationship to citizens. It is not what I want. And parenthetically, I will suggest that this is an extraordinary political debate in the United States, as we have politician after politician who will insist that their personal values should be the basis of public policy. We can go on. For example, the Council of Europe in 2000 offers a code of conduct. And if you look at the three elements of the code itself, defining the unethical climate, the expectation of standards from the individuals, and lastly, the information to the public, are essentially, if you want to think about it in another way, this is ensuring the integrity of the process itself. What this leads to is a necessary discussion on the concept of professionalism in the public service. I'm going to skip through this, though inevitably I have to mention, I don't know why, but Max Weber, the German sociologist, maybe because it turns out that the first American translation of the work that I'm going to cite is 70 years ago. It came, the United States first encountered it in 1946, though it was lectures from 1919. He talks about the politics as vocation, but what he's talking about is the importance of an ethic of responsibility as the core value of those in the public service. Again, this is a value in which we emphasize, which Weber emphasized, as exploring the consequences of actions. Again, we're taking it out of the realm of the personal and putting it back into the sense of what is the result of what I do for others. I'll skip that. I'm not going to say too much about performance measurements because Patria has already discussed this, but I just want to make one or two comments here because it does fit, because at the conclusion I'm going to try to make draw some parallels between the notion of measuring performance and measuring integrity. And the first notion is that if we're looking at performance, it is a lot more complicated than we would necessarily believe, and make one or 2 points here. First is that more than 50 years ago, David Stanley, in a paper from 1964, said that we need to do measurement processes at 3 levels: an impressionistic, presumptive, and proven levels. What he meant by the way, by proven is statistically evidence-based, technologically based analysis. But he offers 3 levels of analysis, not 1. Most of the work since 1964 has treated as though there was only 1 level by which to do analysis. It has left some of the discussions rather bereft. For example, when you do performance measurement in the context of budgeting, we find that we end up with analyses that are devoid of any real context in which things are done, and the result is that Gloria Grizzle wrote a paper in 1982 in which she makes note that we need measuring systems that are flexible. I know, all the statisticians in the room just went, oh my gosh, flexibility. As Patria said earlier, we keep changing the numbers. We use different questions in the questionnaires and throw everything out the window as a result. And yet here, some 30 plus years ago, we have someone saying, in fact, that's necessary. At least in this context. It is absolutely necessary. I wonder where I am. Let's see. All right. So how, if we were to look at this, if we're looking at the integrity of decision making, again, this is a quote from Selznick. He notes, organizations are technical instruments designed as means to definite goals. They are judged on engineering premises. They are expendable. Institutions, whether conceived as groups or practices, may be partially engineered, but they also have a natural dimension. They are products of interaction and adaptation, and they become receptacles of group idealism. They are less readily expendable. Integrity is ultimately the transformation of mere organizations into one of Selznick's institutions. I've only got one more page. I'm on track. I'm not sure how I managed to do that, but what I want to do is to, I'm going to skip discretion, because if you start me talking to discretion, we'll be here for another hour. So David's happy. We're skipping discussion on discretion. And I want to make one final note here about how we think about things. Gareth Morgan, a Canadian sociologist in 1989, wrote a book in which he talks about the importance of metaphors. In fact, he says this is how we shape our understanding of our world, but particularly our organizations, that we apply a set of notions which we are comfortable with as metaphors that explain what the organization is. But it goes beyond merely an explanation of what we see, because we take it almost as normative. We expect and ultimately demand that the organizations look like an organization based on our preferred metaphor. So if we've been trained as engineers would be, or quite frankly, lawyers would be, we will see organizations as machine-like. And therefore, we will judge an organization to the extent to which, when we observe behaviors, it acts like a machine. His book creates, by the way, I think 12 or 13 different metaphors that operate. But what's important is that individuals and organizational cultures ultimately take on this value. They adopt a dominant metaphor, and they function on the basis of that metaphor. And the people or events that push you out of your comfort zone of a metaphor, there's going to be a pushback against it. So the culture itself becomes important. What we have, therefore, is a topic in which we have asking ourselves to measure something that can't be seen. It is the choices we make before we engage. Again, the experience of stranger-to-stranger elements, and so on. So, skip it. If we're going to measure integrity, we need flexible, impressionistic, presumptive systems of analysis. We need to accept the idea that integrity is embedded in choices made prior to the experience. We need the trustworthiness is a judgment made by citizens of strangers. It's people they've never met. So it is if you wish, it's the leap of faith to engage the government. The reality in many parts of the world right now, sadly, is that the choice is not to engage, that we opt out. The lack of data in some cases, either the refusal to provide it or the whole question of whether statistics are accurate, is often because we have a situation in which people chose not to report crimes, chose not to go to a government agency for help. They may, in some parts of the world, in some situations, turn to others. There was a comment yesterday at the expert panel about the concept of illegal governance, where non-government organizations, quite frankly and occasionally criminal or terrorist groups, are successfully providing public services. Why can that occur? The answer is that those organizations, criminal and terrorist organizations, are more trusted. They are trustworthy. They will provide the service in a way we perceive that the government will not. So we turn to those organizations for help. Scary. I have a whole bunch of suggestions, too many of them to add or even discuss, and probably too small for some of you to read, maybe, or at least only me. we need to operationalize these values. Actually, I am done. The way we're going to be able to do it, because the dynamic involves two strangers, we need to talk to the two stranger groups. We need citizen surveys, broadly speaking, not of victimization of victims as they've entered the system, because again, that may be a very small slice of the people as they experience our government. Rather, it's more the classic broad citizen survey, but it's focused on the question of trustworthiness. If you have a problem, would you go there? Yes or no? If you have a problem, what is your expectation of your treatment? Will you be treated by a person who is professional and will support you or not? So those are the kind of questions you would ask in a public survey. There's also needs to be questions about the organizational ethos, because this is the other part where I think that we let down. We need to ask the question of the people in the organization to judge their level of professionalism in this particular case. We also need to understand broadly the concept of integrity as reflecting broad public values rather than organizational rules. And so you can simply ask those questions. Can you give me an example of broad public values on display by the behavior of a colleague? Sadly, in many organizations, the answer will be, I can't think of one. I wish. Okay, wow. We'll skip through this. I have some other things. What's important here is to understand that measuring integrity, again, corruption is not necessarily the opposite. Trustworthiness is the key notion because that dictates where we go as people for help. And that trustworthiness becomes a trust issue when we go to government and what we experience is less than satisfactory experience. Not about the judgment, but in terms of the professionalism with which we experience that government when we seek help. And I think that's what's important. And we need to ask the questions of the public, but also of public servants to be able to understand that dynamic. And then maybe we can start answering Benedict's question about why in some countries you have high crime rates and you presume that it's because most people report, and you're thinking that there's low crime rates in other places because it's not being reported. It's buried in these surveys. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Raymond. Les recuerdo que vamos a tener algunos minutos para preguntas y respuestas. Por ahí están algunos papelitos para que ahí puedan escribir sus preguntas y hacérnoslas llegar para la parte final de la sesión. Y bueno, pues presento ahora a Robert Balenick. Él es el director de programas de Open Society Justice Initiative. Balenick estuvo un buen tiempo en mi alma mater organizacional, que es el CIDE, y ahí fundó varios estudios sobre justicia criminal y seguridad pública, e incluso una clínica que en aquel momento estaba pensada para lidiar con el asunto del abuso sexual y el tráfico de personas. Bueno, pues sin más, Robert Balenick, adelante, gracias.
Thank you. When you're at the end of the alphabet or at the end of the session, you've got to learn to talk quickly or briefly or both. So I'm the advocate on the panel. I add a little bit of diversity, and just to situate my talk, I'm really focused on sort of the reform of Mexico's criminal procedure. As those of you who follow the country closely and live in it, we're about 10 days away from the magic deadline for implementation of the new system. I think as we're speaking, there's a giant conference going on in Mexico City with political and sort of governance elites talking about where we stand on the reform. And as an advocate, I guess the message and the concern that motivates my work and this talk is that if we don't have a way of really measuring what the system is doing, how it's reflecting values, how it understands, what its operators understands whether they're reflecting values, the reform gets hollow. And a hollow reform is probably a bigger threat than a counter-reform. We may not unlegislate what we've legislated, but we can certainly undo or not do what that new legislation should mean by simply not acting in the spirit of those things. And that's the motivating concern. So it's appropriate that we're sitting here in Merida because this work actually is the product of a collaboration with the government of Merida to look at this question of measurement. We actually started coming, this project began as an attempt to develop a basket of indicators to measure pretrial detention and whether it was excessively used or not. But when we arrived here, something made us change our focus, and that was really the political problem or concern that exists in Merida and in Yucatan generally. And when I speak of Yucatan, I really would like everyone to understand that I'm really speaking of it as an example of what I imagine is going on in the beating hearts of governors and officials in every state of the union as they try to grapple with the political fate of this reform, right? Will it succeed? Will it be seen to succeed? Will I succeed with this reform? And so the political concern that we saw was that the reform in Merida, in Yucatan more generally, was being questioned. Now, Yucatan is considered one of the more Pacific states in the Union. It doesn't have the degree of serious crime or instability. It's a much stabler by the numbers and I think by the lived experience of people than many other states in the Union. But despite that, the concern reflected in the media and in sort of public opinion is that there's greater impunity in the new system. And that is a concern that is felt deeply, we learned, by the operators of the system, who were very candid about it in our first conversations. And why was that? Probably because the most politically important piece of data, in other words, the piece of data that's most readily published and used and perceived is the number of cases making it to the courts, and as a sort of derivative of that, number of convictions in those cases. The old system apparently was generating about 10 times the number of court cases than the new system was. And that fact made everybody nervous. Now, when we arrived and learned this and we were asked to come to Yucatan by Ministry of Interior here, which noted that Yucatan was undergoing its own process of developing indicators. Now, performance indicators for this overall criminal justice reform have been very tricky. I think the country was pretty late in looking at performance indicators as a thing they needed to measure. And in Yucatan, they seemed to be ahead of the game because they were already doing it, but each agency was developing its own indicator depending on its own definition of success. So police were overwhelmingly picking indicators that had to do with arrest volume, detention volume, numbers, how many bodies are we putting in boxes or rooms that have locks on them. Prosecutors were focused on how successful they were in getting judges to grant their request, whether it was a request to bring someone to trial, a request for pretrial detention. That was what they were measuring. And the courts tend to zero in on how many cases in and how many cases out. Now, it was pretty clear that those numbers are not going to tell anybody anything very meaningful about whether the system is actually meeting the expectations, upholding the values you'd like to see in a criminal justice system. How many people are arrested, how many cases we did, it's decontextualized. It's not very useful. Perhaps more important from the point of view of a system evolving into a better place, those measures tend to get agencies into conflicts with each other. If I'm focused on the volume of my detention and somebody else is focusing on trying cases that are good cases and winnable cases and they're filtering out many cases, I've got a conflict. I've got a conflict between my police and my prosecutors. That's not a Yucatan problem. That's not a Mexico problem. That's a universal problem when you start counting these things. So there was really no indication that people were using some examination of system performance to pick their indicators. There was no sense that they were trying to figure out how the overall system was functioning. They were about to set themselves up for ongoing conflict by letting each agency decide what it would measure. And then those struggles would presumably be played out in public opinion, the media, and if you happen to be sitting in a position of political responsibility in the state, you're going to have a hard time explaining why this new system, with the changes that it wrought, was actually a better deal for the citizens of the state or of the country than the system that we came from. So we proposed a different process, that we tried to get the agencies sitting together. We wanted to find a way to engage non-technocrats, including senior political people. So we needed a way for things to be visual and easy to interpret. We wanted to identify areas where agencies, their agendas, and the tensions could be brought to the surface to start to deal with the conflicts that occur when each agency is defining its own mode of success. We obviously wanted to identify sources of success. What were the good stories you could tell? Because reform, like any other aspect of governments, only works and sustained when there's political value to those who hold the levers of government to actually make it do what it's supposed to do. So this first slide is a homemade chart. Now this is court cases. These happen to be court cases in the category of sexual crimes in roughly the first year of the new system in Yucatan. They all happen to take place in Mérida, which is about 2/3 of the crime that's reported in the state. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I just want to say on your y-axis, a made-up index. We just created a coercion index, which essentially said, how much does the state have to use its coercive capacity to get somebody through to a trial? Roughly, that's pretrial detention. It's other precautionary measures, what's known in here as medidas cautelares. You get more points for pretrial detention, which is an extreme measure, and you get points for every month that measure is in place. And on the x-axis, the length of the process. You'll see 3 black dotted lines. Those are median durations of the new system in the various trimesters of the first year. And the various outcomes are reflected by the shapes, and red is people who are in pretrial detention to assure that they make it through trial, and green is people who are not. And at the far end is a yellow line, which is the median of prison sentences handed out. So this is essentially a tool to show to the security cabinet of the government and say, what do you see? So there's a couple of things you can see. First of all, there's a pretty good distribution. There's a lot of different types of outcomes here. The old system was generally known as a fairly binary one. Your case either went someplace to trial or it gathered dust in some kind of archive. So there was kind of a, roughly speaking, an either or. The new system seems to demonstrate that there's a distribution. There's a number of things you can do, including agreements between the parties, including suspending the process against someone conditioned on complying with certain things, pardon. One thing you notice if you look at those black lines is that the speed of the process is getting faster. The first trimester is in the middle, got a little slower in the second trimester. By the time the year was ending, however, the system was resolving cases much, much quicker. And for a system that had often been described as so slow that people would sit in pretrial detention and serve the sentence that they might have gotten if they were convicted, the difference between that yellow line, that median prison term, and those black lines is striking. So the system's rapidity is notable, the diversity, and for a system that is criticized for impunity, there's a pretty interesting distribution of prison terms, which also indicate that the system is actually managing to dispense justice when it convicts. One thing to point out, if you look at the triangles, the second most common outcome is a pardon. Now, these are sexual crimes. So this is a question, and this is where this particular homemade form of visualization of actual cases can allow officials to think about what's going on. Why pardons in sexual crimes? One hears anecdotal stories about family pressures and others to drop cases, but the question is, in another case, if these were theft cases, pardons might be a good and efficient and rather humane way to resolve cases. When you deal with sexual crimes, it's at least reason to look further and examine what's going on there. Is there a subterranean policy of not prosecuting as vigorously when a woman makes an accusation of rape? Are these cases involving child molestation within the family, and there's sort of a cover-up going on? So that's the reason why these charts are broken down to crime categories. And of course, they could be broken down further. So if we move to the next slide, which is, Raymond, could I ask you to? This is robbery. So by the way, these are all actual cases, right? Each shape here is a case. So what you see in robbery is also same pattern and duration. The system's getting much faster. It's distributing prison sentences in a roughly equal way. It's about a third of the cases that are under 18 months, about a third between 18 and 30, and about a third sort of in the range of 4 years and up. So people are not serving time in pretrial detention to the point where if they were convicted, they would essentially get that as their sentence. If you look at, there's about half the cases are people who are not in pretrial detention for these theft crimes, and of all those cases, only 2 people fled from justice, right? We don't quite know what happened at the end of this case, but 2 people failed to appear at court processes. So what's happening here is in a relatively, and this is not a sample, this is all the theft cases in the first year that made it to trial. What you have is a pretty good distribution of outcomes, a good sort of movement towards rapidity, and at the same time, not a situation where all these cases are being resolved in a day, which is probably also a pretty good sign of a system that's exercising some thoughtfulness regarding what it's doing. So, the point I want to make with these charts is this. What you have here and what we've experienced sitting with people in the government is that they can actually look at this and say, where do I see a pattern I like, right? Am I happy that I'm able to get most of the cases between those 2 black lines there, those duration medians? Can I create an indicator that actually reflects the reality I'm seeing? Can I look for a target with regard to those indicators that I know I can make because I'm starting to see evidence that, in fact, the system's preserving it? So from our point of view, rather than starting, as Yucatan was going to do, by having each agency draw up its list of indicators, let them look at what the system is doing and let them make the indicators last. So that's, so the end story here is that there's actually some interesting agility in the system. There's certainly a relatively good story to be told for rational use of resources, because the system is not putting people pretrial detention if they don't need to be. The system is not taking people all the way to trial if that's not the most efficient way to end the case. So there seems to be a pretty good story here, but these are the small percentage of cases that are making it to the courts. The challenge across Mexico is figuring out what's going on in that investigative stage. So if we could move to another slide, and I'll just show very quickly. Part of the difficulties, and as we enlarge the numbers here, the values seem to disappear. But if you look, this is theft cases, all theft cases from 2014, 2015, in both the old and the new system. And what you have is, you see a substantial drop. Go to the next one. If you look at, now this is a subcategory, this is minor theft. You see the same pattern, essentially, a real drop from the top, which is the old system, to the first 2 years of the new system, which covered both 2014 and 2015. Keep going. Then if you change to major theft, there's an increase and then a decrease. And by the way, these are increases of 31%, 51%, 27%, and 38%. And if you go to the last slide there, you have this final very strong increase in housebreaking. That number at the bottom is 310. And let's just compare that. These figures are, by the way, taken from case files in the prosecutor's office. If you go to the next slide, these are figures from the Public Security Secretariat. That is robo caso habitación, that is housebreaking. That last number for 2015 was 310. According to the prosecutor, they received 310 cases. According to SSAP, they had 1,451. So just to say that when you get into the investigative phase, you are dealing with a numbers challenge that's extraordinary. I'll add to this that even within the prosecutor's office, we are constructing a database that links the investigative process phases. What actually happens when a case goes from investigation and someone decides that the case ought to be taken to the judicial process, they walk the file over. And the link between whatever data is captured in the investigations unit and the data that is captured in the processes or court cases unit doesn't exist. That link is entirely broken. It makes it very difficult to tell what's going on. If we could just continue. This is what happens in very broad terms. And this is what one needs to start thinking about. These are outputs and outcomes in the investigative phase. You just need to look at those two very tall sets of bars in the middle. These are pending cases, so investigations that haven't yet achieved an outcome. And next to them is cases that have essentially been archived. For all intents and purposes, once you get past a couple hundred days, they're all dead cases. So if you look at what happens with cases going into the investigative unit of the prosecutor, the vast majority of them are ending in one of those two ways without a significant outcome. What is notable, since the red lines are the traditional system, the old system, and the yellow and green lines are the new, is that the new system has changed in one interesting way, which is still not quite explained, which is that instead of archiving cases, they keep them open. So the new system has a large number of open cases, whereas the old system would have archived them. Okay, so let's just move on to the next slide. So these three slides say one thing. They're an attempt by us to figure out how to create conversations about tensions, to really push performance conversations. So if you take a look at this chart, these are investigations that axis at the bottom is time. On the right-hand side, what you see are cases that are in either archived or still open. And this is the old system. The red are cases, in Spanish, con detenido. Those are cases that started in the system with the police arresting someone en flagrancia, red-handed, as we say in English. That's the notion. If you have, and these are robberies. These are aggravated robberies. They're serious cases, but they're not complex cases. The numbers associated with those red cases, those red-handed arrests, are roughly from just about 570 to over 700 days. When you have those red-handed cases sitting without resolution for 700 days in the prosecutor's office, you've either got a problem with who you're arresting or how you're investigating. That's the old system. Now let's move to the new system. A lot more of those red cases. So what you see is a lot more decisions not yet to move with those red-handed cases in robbery. Same type of crimes, new system, and the pattern is very marked. Still a lot of open cases. A lot of them are red. And if you go to 2015, they are almost entirely. So that is, from a point of view of system measurement, I'm not going to say what it means, but it's a conversation that has to be had. So the aim of the visualizations was simply to make it as clear as we could to people representing, well, civil society, the courts, the prosecutors, the police, that there's a question here that needs to be resolved. Okay, so that is to say, we could figure out So one of the challenges we will obviously have here is as we start to take this data and bring it into inter-agency conversations, there has to be a value for everybody to figure out what it is that would motivate change, right? So I left out of this the interpretive framework that we used, but I've talked a little bit about agility. I've talked a little bit about rational use of resources, and I'll talk a little bit about the care that a system takes in making sure that it doesn't inflict greater vulnerability on witnesses, on complainants, on defendants. One of the challenges that we have to figure out is how to create a way in which those indicators actually can be translated into the values that the system should be seen to be upholding. So if we have cases that are pending for many, many days, you're wasting time of prosecutors. If you have cases that were supposedly red-handed arrests that aren't going anywhere, you need to be thinking about your arrest patterns or your investigation capacity. If you're resolving everything by various forms of pretrial resolution, but you're still publishing data that are about the number of cases going into court, you're doing yourself and the reform process a disservice by keeping people focused on a number that doesn't necessarily tell them what they want and need to know. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. As always, too many very good ideas to discuss, not enough time to actually interact and keep going on this discussion. Nevertheless, in order to finish on time and let you go to lunch, I would like to ask Patria and Raymond to answer two questions we got. Please, Patria.
So this question is from Pedro Porce, and he asks, in terms of achieving long-term goals in design implementation of policies, how can developing countries overcome the shortcomings of an undertrained, unproductive bureaucracy that is tied to politics? So Pedro, that is a very good question, the million-dollar answer, but I have some ideas. Basically, I think that, and of course this may sound very simplistic of a response, but I really think, and going back to what Raymond said, it's about professionalizing the public administrators, professionalizing the bureaucracy, those who work in the bureaucracy. And I think that particularly organizations, funding agencies have a role to play in doing that. And they can do that, one, by, first of all, stop bringing políticas de maletín, which are just these politics, you just come, boom, put it there, let's implement it. And then when they see that things don't work, oh my gosh, what happened? We just wasted money. Well, of course it didn't work. Did you look at the context? And part of the context is really, is the public apparatus prepared to have this kind of implementation? So we really need to continue to provide this. Yes, we need to continue to provide this technical assistance, but the technical assistance needs to be something that's sustainable, that creates knowledge, that stays in the country, and that can help to really professionalize these individuals. I remember, for example, in the Dominican Republic, I did a little study on the reform, and they did some good things, but always politics is going to have an impact, and we can't really get away from it because that's just how it is. But I think that they did make progress there, but it's like, can the funding organizations keep them accountable? And I don't think that there's really any kind of accountability per se. It's that part of you getting this money, which in many cases, and it bothers me, is money that you have to pay back on the backs of your citizens. Can you show results? But to show results, you have to build a professional public administration that has the knowledge, the capacity to really implement these policies, because these policies look really good. And I remember the policy, for example, they did in the Dominican Republic this presupuesto local or something, like trying to bring back like 5% of the budget so it could be managed at the municipal level. But well, if you don't have the knowledge, if you don't have the capacity, what do you think is going to happen with that money? So I really think that building a professional public sector is part of the answer, and I can say that because really the United States, and please don't think that I think the United States is perfect, and by all means, especially now with this election cycle that we have right now, but I think that we do have some really efficient and effective organizations that were not like that. We were really, back in the 1900s, that's really what, when 1887, Woodrow Wilson talked about the professionalization of public administration, that was taken to heart. And we need to do that in Latin America. We need to do that in developing countries. And we do have great organizations, great institutions, like the CEDAW, for example, who are focusing on that. So I believe it can be done. We can do it.
Thank you, Pat. Raymond, please.
Question from Jose Maria Athabal. Is that how I pronounce it, or Azabal?
Yeah, absolutely.
Athabal. The question is, and this is the English translation of this, how to change negative dynamics in organizations' culture that is old and resistant. I'd be selling my book if I knew exactly the answer to that question. But I think part of this is that we have to be attentive, in fact, to the culture. And we often are not. That we enter organizations, whether at entry and accept it, and our effort is to blend in, or if we come in at other levels through, we have a tendency to look at what's going on as just the way things are done. It's the classic question, why do you do it that way? It's the way we've always done it. And I think the first step is for people at the level of management to find that response unacceptable. And if you can start from that challenge, you give me an answer that isn't, this is the way we've always done it, and begin to explore what's going on. And then you can move into the precepts of professionalism, ethics of responsibility, this notion of integrity. And if some of the questionnaires I was suggesting can serve as a reinforcement. If you have information from the public that basically said, I would never go to that organization for help, to challenge, why is this occurring? What are we doing wrong that people won't come to us, is going to challenge the culture that is, quote, old and resistant. The reason they're resistant is they're content with the way they're doing it because they don't think they're going to be called to account. And something as simple as a citizen survey will begin to challenge that complacency that's at the core of being old and resistant. It's the same thing can be done as part of the challenge to how we do things in organizations as a basis for organizational change. You know, decades ago, there was a notion of transformational leadership. We're not going to get into that too much, but the basic assumption is the primary role of leaders, and leaders, by the way, can be anyone in an organization, not merely the bosses, that organizational change is on the basis of changing the culture. Until you accept the idea that the culture is defective, you're not going to change anything. And those who are old and resistant have won the day.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.